So I've got, oh yes, I'm wired, okay. Let me look for the microphone. Thanks so much, Gary, for those kind words and for inviting me here in the first place, both to talk to you and to sort of mess up your landscape with my thing. Yes, the original title, I think, was After Art, ? So it gets even closer to this title. In the movie The Day After Tomorrow, I don't know if any of you saw that, one of the tipping points of climate change has actually happened. New York is underwater and the eastern seaboard is iced over, and the Hobbesian world of the war of all against all seems to have begun. For years, I led an interdisciplinary seminar devoted to global climate change. It became clear that, as we had suspected, the big questions were philosophical and political ones. Our responsibility to future generations, the adequacy of our social and political institutions to respond to the challenge, the ambivalence of various religious responses, and so on. And I came to the broad conclusion that the main problem was that while we as a species can respond well to an imminent danger, one that we can see ahead of us, in front of us, we're less impressive when it comes to dangers in the distant future. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, as the saying goes. But why are we so unwilling to act on our long-term interest? Well, one answer is that those interests are somehow not pressing or not vividly enough present to us. It's tempting for philosophers to think that a good article or a good book should do the trick, or having the ear of the philosopher king. But deep down we know that's not the answer. We need to activate the imagination, not just reason. Reason has already spoken when it comes to climate change and so on, and its verdict has fallen on deaf ears. Instead, we need to arouse action through a powerful and vivid anticipation of the future. The trouble with The Day After Tomorrow is that while it depicted a frightening future, it was not believable. It seemed like a movie. And yet, if indeed the problem is the failure of the imagination, wouldn't it be reasonable to look to art more broadly for the resources we need? And the question then would become, can art save the earth? Can art bridge the imagination gap in the way that, for example, Picasso's Guernica might remind us of the horrors of war? And could that happen if, as has often been claimed, art is dead? I mean, if art is dead, how could art save us? Now, I'm just wondering if there's a possibility of having a light that would shine upon me. Not the sun, but just a little artificial light. Is that possible? That's... Yes, thank you. That's not ruining it for you, is it? No. Well, obviously we need to ask what might be meant by art then. But before that, I think we need to get clear about what we mean by earth. I mean, if art's going to save the earth, what do we mean by earth? And it's not as simple as it might seem. When we think of environmental destruction, we think about mass species extinction, changes in temperature, changes in weather patterns, disruptions to life-sustaining systems, melting ice caps, rising sea levels, and so on. I just came back from Bangladesh, in which rising sea levels are going to inundate a quarter of their entire country. The Maldives will be no more. I mean, it's a serious issue. The Earth itself as a planet will be eaten by the sun in 7 billion years. But it's not the Earth as a planet that I'm talking about, a big piece of rock. Saving the Earth is not a matter of preserving just a lump of rock, nor some idyllic snapshot Earth, freezing it at some artificially privileged moment. So what does saving the Earth mean? Now, the philosophical tradition that I work in has not been silent on this question. When Nietzsche spoke of being true to the Earth, he was in the context of warning us to guard against those life-denying moves that would project salvation or the good onto some transcendent realm. This not only generates false solutions, on his view, it blinds us to the multi-layered complexity and dynamism of Earth. Earth is both our unsentimentally material groundedness, and when we come to understand this, it's an opening onto a different kind of thinking and responsibility. Now, Husserl, the father of phenomenology, Husserl's sense of Earth as what he calls our original ark, as in like a Noah's Ark, is an attempt to recover phenomenologically a sense of the Earth as the unmoving center and condition of our lives, one in which there are still sunsets and sunrises, one which reinstates a sort of pre-Copernican situatedness, even as we, accept, in some other sense, that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Nonetheless, phenomenologically, it functions like that for us. With Heidegger, though, things get more complex. Earth is evoked in various places in the context of what he calls the fourfold, a kind of fundamental dimensionality of significance within which human dwelling could be said to be suspended. He talks about earth and sky and mortals and gods. These are sort of two axes, if you like, and four different dimensions of our existence. And he writes explicitly about saving the earth as intimately linked to human dwelling. And I just quote you a little section here. He says, mortals dwell in that they save the earth. Saving does not only snatch something from a danger, that it's not just about avoiding climate change. To save really means to set something free into its own essence. Saving the earth does not master the earth and doesn't subjugate it, which is merely one step from boundless spoliation. So Heidegger's talking about avoiding the temptation to try to dominate or master the earth. Saving the earth means recognizing earth as earth, bearing witness, one might say, to the way in which its powers operate before and beneath what we call our consciousness and our subjectivity. But what is Earth? It's no mere planet. Rather, as he puts it, it's the serving bearer, blossoming and fruiting, spreading out in rock and water, rising up into plant and animal. Very close to what he elsewhere calls physis, which is the origin of our word physics. Dwelling consists in responding to the fourfold more broadly, acknowledging the shape of the cosmic canvas on which our lives are written, and considering Earth in particular. Art comes into its own in an essay he wrote called The Origin of a Work of Art. And in that essay, Heidegger understands a work of art as animating what he calls the strife between world and earth, setting up a world and setting forth the earth. A Greek temple, for example, is a site of ritual marking and celebration of significant human events. A world born up on a rock. Imagine this temple sitting on a rock on the edge of the Greek coast, whose power is at the same time recessive, hidden, background. So the temple, as it were, is up there, and the rock is recessive. It's not presenting itself. Architecture, as art, lets, on Heidegger's view, lets the struggle between the human world and this more recessive earth appear as such, as a sort of struggle, as a tension. And in this sense, says Heidegger, art discloses truth. I'll just give you a little bit more of his weird language. The world is the self-opening openness of the broad paths and the simple and essential decisions in the history, in the destiny of a historical people. The earth is the spontaneous forthcoming of that which is continually self-secluding and and to that extent sheltering and concealing. The world grounds itself on the earth, and the earth juts through world. So he's talking about a sort of tension between what we humans produce and the ground on which we produce it. Now, initially, it's tempting to work with at least the broad thrust of Heidegger's understanding of Earth. Those concerned that Heidegger excludes animals from having a world, which he does, they don't have a world, or they have a very poor world, may be relieved to discover that they have a place, at least in Earth. What I'd like to draw out of this characterization of Earth is Heidegger's insistence on Earth as a sort of hidden process. It's not something to be dominated, not because it would thereby be damaged materially, but because it shouldn't be thought of as a thing at all, at least not in that sense. Central to Heidegger's understanding of saving the Earth here is the idea of Earth as an event or process, and of saving it as letting it to be understood as an event or a process, inhabiting it in that way. And here, I think art, whether it's as architecture or painting or poetry, plays or can play a vital role. Now, we can still argue about whether, as it sometimes seems on Heidegger's view, Earth is still being characterized on a very sort of humanistic perspective, thinking as he does about truth, whereas other people like Deleuze and Guattari in their little chapter on geophilosophy are talking more about what they call pre-human or post-human forces. So some people get worried that Heidegger's still thinking about the Earth in a very humanistic way, and others are trying to think beyond that. My version of what we might call the Earth worth saving is one in which the value of the lump of rock, water and air that we live on is intimately connected with the fact that it's the home of living beings. And hence, I think the home of any kind of value at all. What's at stake for me is some version of the Earth as a milieu in which life is sustained and evolving. Such an Earth, or Earth thought of in that way, is home to all kinds of creative powers, which includes human beings, among other creatures and processes. So I'm trying to think of Earth, as it were, as a site in which life is abundantly and creatively evolving. Heidegger's answer as to whether art can save the Earth is tempting, but it can't simply be affirmed. You can't just, in my view, just say yes to Heidegger. He rescues us from Hegel's verdict that art is a thing of the past, but at the price of reaffirming Hegel's focus on the historical destiny of a people. Is this the kind of language we want to be stuck with? Perhaps we need, as Heidegger would say, to go to his encounter. We need to sort of think through the kind of problem that Heidegger really thought he had, and maybe think it through more deeply. Find out what is fundamentally at stake for him in saving the Earth. Now, it's clear that in this little essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, and it becomes explicit in a postscript he wrote to this, that Heidegger is taking issue with Hegel's famous dictum, which is summarized like this. He says, in terms of its highest destiny, art has become, for us, a thing of the past. Now, Hegel's argument is really very simple. It's that if freedom and truth are the highest human values, which, sometimes we could sign up to that, then it's philosophy that we should be looking to, or science, maybe even religion, but not art any longer, to try to realize those values of freedom and truth. In other words, art's been superseded by philosophy and science. In the modern era, art just becomes a matter of pleasure and taste and imagination, but not enlightenment, not truth. Heidegger's response is that Hegel's verdict rests on a contestable understanding of truth. If, as Heidegger suggests, the kind of truth that Hegel privileges truth as correctness or correspondence is actually derivative from another deeper sense of truth, truth as disclosure or disclosedness, letting things come into the open, letting things be visible, understanding earth as earth, getting it, then if art has a special capacity to bring that about, then it has a continuing vital role to play in our culture. In other words, Hegel got truth wrong. Art may not be able to realize truth in that sort of theoretical way, but it can realize or bring about or show or disclose truth in the way that Heidegger is talking about. That is, letting us see Earth as Earth. Not just as a lump of rock, but as the condition of our dwelling and so on and so on. Now, you might say that the fate of art, what has all this got to do? What's this sort of detour through Hegel and Heidegger got to do with the question of art as it really developed in the 20th century? Let me just see if I can, what happened to, hold on. Yes, that was Van Gogh's shoes. One of the key paintings that Heidegger talks about in his essay. But I wanted to move on. My question is, well, how relevant are these discussions about truth to the question of whether art can save the earth? If, given that art really did develop in all kinds of extraordinary ways in the 20th century, if Duchamp's fountain, there we go, and Warhol's Brillo pads are art, or if they can be successfully absorbed into what we call the history of art, then Rosalind Krauss's account of sculpture's expanded field, as she called it, could be applied more generally to art. Anything goes. If embodying meaning and being about something, as Arthur Danto might have said, is enough to qualify an item as art, it's just got to have some sort of meaning and it's got to be about something, then it's art, then maybe something has died. Maybe the idea of art in a more substantial way has disappeared. And that was indeed the heart of Danto's renewal of Hegel's claim about the death of art in 1984. And the story that he told went something like this. First of all, only mimesis, only imitation was art. Then several things were art, but they all tried to extinguish each other. And then finally it became apparent there were no constraints on what would count as art. And as soon as there are no constraints, as soon as anything goes, art is dead, because we have no idea what it means any longer. There are no standards any longer. Now this conclusion, to my mind, seemed premature. Not because art just continues unabashed and unabated. That was true for Hegel too. It's premature, the idea that art is dead, because unless you're a rigid essentialist, the fact that there's now no agreed understanding of what art is as much a testimony to its continuing vitality as to its death. If there's no consensus about what love is, that doesn't mean that love is dead. It just means that its meaning is contested. The end of art claim was ambiguous as to whether it meant there was no longer an uncontested understanding of its cultural significance, or whether it's nobody cared anymore. If Danto's own role, he was a serious art critic for the nation, is anything to go by, the latter was surely not true. It's not true that nobody cared about what art was. He wrote, I could do something as an art critic that I couldn't do as a philosopher, namely philosophize. So there's obviously a lot of critical activity going on. But what if it was only art criticism that continued to thrive and not art? Well, this seems implausible too. If art provokes art criticism, then it's philosophically interesting. Can't be quite dead. But we need to ask whether instead the model of art whose funeral rites are being repeatedly read out, typically one which privileges a certain consensus about great art, has not become a distraction. might not art function without that consensus, without the need to be producing great works of art, indeed with even greater vitality? In other words, couldn't art be continuing without aspiring to greatness? Now, it could be argued this whole discussion of art is very parochial, focused as it seems to be on the West, and implicitly on the fate of high art or great art in the last 200 years. Well, I'm not going to argue too much about that question. Suffice it to say that exposure to a multiplicity of art traditions is part of what leads to Dante's and other people's claims about the end of art. And it's no accident the question about whether art can save the earth is indeed being posed as distinctively pressing at the beginning of the 21st century, faced with a future largely a product of Western lifestyles and modes of production. How we think of art may indeed profit from non-Western considerations, but it cannot but start from the culture that's generating the problem that it just might help address. So how can we best think of that culture? So I'm trying to say that the fact that some of this issue to do with the end of art seems, maybe very Western, why won't we look elsewhere in the world, is not inappropriate, because the West is actually the cause of the problem of environmental destruction. So maybe we should look to that tradition for a solution. So how can we best think of this Western culture? Well, there's a famous book on the culture industry by Adorno and Horkheim, which, despite their antipathy to Heidegger, seems to parallel in some ways Heidegger's concerns about the power of technology and the age of the Gestell, the age of framing or construct, as it's sometimes translated. The reduction of art to an exchangeable commodity would seem to make it part of the problem rather than part of the solution. When Heidegger says, in other words, if you've got a problem that our society has become a sort of commodified and commodity-producing society, and part of that is what leads to, not just social problems, but even environmental problems. And if art is all too easily turned into a commodity, how is art going to help us drag ourselves out of the mess? Well, when Heidegger says that only, and he says this in 1976, I think, that only a God can save us, only a God can save us now, or can still save us, reflecting a bit less optimistically in our prospects in his later years, he is alluding to the gods of the German poet Hölderlin. That is to say, possibilities, hopes that lie outside our current human imaginings, perhaps what Derrida would call the impossible. These gods, these shapes of possibility, are proposed and sustained by a poetry that seems far removed from the commodity world. But Heidegger holds out little hope for modern art. And I quote, "I don't think modern art points out a path." So Heidegger's not very hopeful about what modern art can do for us. At best, he thinks thinking and poetry, and maybe art of some other sort, can prepare the way for the return of the gods. So he doesn't think that art, to put it crudely, can do the job. It can, at the best, make it possible for the job to be done if the time is right. Now, we may well suppose that the commodification of art is an especially intractable problem because both art and commodities work through appearances. That art can become a commodity with what Marx called a fetish value looks like a substitute for the aura that Benjamin talks about waning in our modern age, the aura of great art. Art is complicit with advertising that creates, promotes, and markets commodities. If a commodity is something whose conditions of production are hidden from view, we might well conclude that the commodity form is precisely the shape of the illusion that allows the destruction of the earth. Think about what happens when we produce goods. We produce things. Our capacity as human beings to externalize the costs, to blind ourselves to the finiteness of natural capital, to focus on exchange value rather than the true cost of things. These kinds of blindness to the effects and the conditions of our productive activity could be described as an aesthetic illusion. One that in the end is to be held responsible for the damage it produces. The idea that we can throw things away. Do you know where this place is? Away? Is a fantasy. There isn't any away. The various forms of estrangement or alienation entailed by the production of commodities are precisely the kinds of dwelling that inhibit truth or unconcealment. While commodities may not be reducible to artworks, they provide a paradigm for the ways in which illusion is constructed and effectively deployed, from which it's very hard for art to distinguish itself, and hard for art to resist. And to the extent that truth or connectedness or transparency or unconcealment is systematically hidden, it's clearly threatened by the commodification of art. Now, I haven't yet assigned some sort of unique or role or function to art, but you'd have to have a pretty narrow view of art as entertainment to allow it just to embrace the commodity form wholeheartedly. Any sense that art might enlighten would then require that enlightenment had become a commodity. Now, of course, in some sense, that's Heidegger's indictment of philosophy. And makes him, he thinks philosophy, in a sense, has got stuck. That philosophy needs to be renewed too and become something more like thinking, so it can escape from the kind of sclerotic categories that it's got locked into. So what do we, supposing we think, yes, we are in this sort of commodified world, does that mean there's sort of no escape, that art gets sucked into it, and so art can't help us to get out of it either? Well, I think Walter Benjamin's analysis of film is helpful here. Film, and this is his essay on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Film, and you could include here photography and the mass reproduction of images more generally, on his view, it frees us from the aura of the original, from servitude to tradition and ritual. I was in the alumni hall house, and there's some beautiful works of art on the walls, and they have a sort of aura, and this is tradition that they are shouting, and a certain respect is due to them. And Benjamin is saying that one of the advantages of mechanical reproduction of images is that sort of disappears. And so we are in some sense freed from the burden of tradition. I shouldn't be saying this in Virginia. This tradition is actually not a burden here, it's something to be honored and respected. But it has obviously, can have that side to it. Film, and once you're released, if you like, from the aura problem, what's opened up is the possibility of a critical response on the part of an audience freed from that irrational aura. And yet film replaces the process of thought too often with compelling sequences of moving images, to which it's all too easy to respond passively. As such, film is also, ripe for propaganda. Film has, in brief, revolutionary potential, but manipulative tendencies. Now, propaganda needn't take the form of triumph of the will. Hollywood cinema is not political in that sense, But its power, the power of Hollywood, for example, to promote and reinforce Western values is evident. And no one could pretend there's some sort of balanced struggle between Hollywood and avant-garde filmmaking. But the logic of Benjamin's analysis is correct, that whatever the complicity between the commodity form and the art scene, there's also a space of transformative possibility. And it's that I want to explore. I'll start out looking at the earth art that flourished at the end of the late 60s and early 70s, and is perhaps being reborn today, where the possibility of art saving the earth could be said to be understood literally and directly. And I subsequently want to argue for a much broader sense of art as able to transform the shape of our dwelling. In other words, I want to start out looking at earth art and say, but it's not just earth art that we should be looking to for salvation. In her book Overlay, the subtitle of which is Contemporary Art and the Art of Prehistory, from the early 80s, Lucy Lippard writes about various ways in which what was then recent art, earthworks, body art, sculpture, renewals of ritual, and so on, draw on prehistoric megaliths, hill drawings, and burial mounds in a kind of renewal of our situatedness in space and time. That was what was going on, she thought. We were getting a renewal of our situatedness in space and time. It sounds very close to what Heidegger's calling the fourfold, the renewal of our sense of a dimensionality to our being. The work of people like Robert Smithson in Spiral Jetty, the order's going to be wrong here. We just go through some of these. I'm sure you've seen these images before. Walter de Maria's Lightning Field, James Turrell's Rodin Crater. I mean, these are sort of the archetypical examples of earth art. Michael Heiser's Double Negative that we started with in the slides, and Christo's Running Fence. These images deliberately, or these works, deliberately cut against the whole gallery system, establishing themselves often in desert landscapes, far from the art scene, far from the city. That's Lightning Field, on the very rare occasion when some lightning actually comes. I'm just running through these. I'm not going to say lots about them. I just want to give you a taste. And this doing work out in the desert, or out in the wild parts of America typically, was a self-conscious choice. These works could not be bought or sold. And they seem to fly in the face of what mechanical reproduction now made possible. They often explicitly staged a renewal of the arc of connectedness between earth and sky in the form of something like cosmic resonance with a spiral, echoing, spiral nebulae in the sky, or electrical storms. The Walter de Maria's Lightning Field connects us to these extraordinary forces of the sky with lightning, or light with Turrell's Crater, which he turned into a sort of light observatory. All this, to me anyway, looks like an attempt to renew aura and ritual and theatre in the sense that critic Michael Fried criticized. Now, of course, from the very beginning, this move away from the gallery or the market scene, this attempt to avoid art as commodity, was riddled with contradictions. All these projects required huge investments of capital, usually from private foundations. There were offshoots of successful corporations like Dyer, or had wealthy private patrons. Christo's insistence on artistic integrity and independence, refusing all forms of outside sponsorship, mean, that running fence cost millions to put up. I think it's 23 miles long. I mean, it's ridiculous. You don't go into the basement just to find some cloth to make it with. This all rested on him, and even now it rests on him selling advanced models and drawings of these things to galleries and patrons and collectors for millions of dollars. And the whole show got off the road, the whole Earth Art show, if you like, got off the road with the Earthworks exhibition at the Dwan Gallery in New York City in 1968. So it began with a gallery and an exhibition. So it's not as if they've escaped the gallery. Soon, Robert Smithson's non-site installations made gallery exhibition integral to the work itself. He had this sort of double site idea, site and non-site. Books and photographs of these works were very much part of the picture. Indeed, the remoteness, inaccessibility, and, in the case of Spiral Jetty, transience of these works made them essentially dependent on photographic representation. Spiral Jetty was iconic as an image. Indeed, as a set of stunningly beautiful images, even when invisibly submerged in the Great Salt Lake. Even when you couldn't see it, when you got there, you could at least take your book with you and see what it's supposed to look like. Now, one could treat these contradictory relations to the gallery system and the art market as explaining why Earth art itself seemed to fade away in the last 2 decades. But it's more plausible that they made it possible in the first place, this contradiction, and gave it a place in art history, and are even making its re-emergence possible. There are new land art, earth art projects bubbling up, even as we speak. There was one in New Mexico last year. There's another one in Mongolia coming up. In my view, we misunderstand the art market and the commodification of art if we think it's fatal to the power of art, even to challenge its own commodity condition. In other words, the commodity market, I mean, commodification is itself contradictory too. It's not a fatal objection that art is a commodity, even if we want to challenge commodification. Conversely, while we might sympathize with Benjamin's analysis of the benefits of shedding of aura and ritual by modern art, that doesn't mean that aura and ritual can't be deployed progressively. They can. Consider, for example, the work of Richard Long, who's an English, well, he says he's not. Let's call him an earth artist. He maps and he records and photographs his walks, both in England and in remote, often scenic parts of the world. This is an attempt, I would say, to ritually resurrect a sense of place, both particular local places and the earth as such, like the earth as Husserl described it as our original ark. And this is where we humans live. This is where we are. It's not an option. It's not just the place we've decided to hang out. And I would say to recommend and celebrate a mode of dwelling in it or on it. Very close, I think, to what Heidegger is calling for. A light touch, leaving nothing, as they say, but footprints. The politics of walking and of the multi-layered historical sedimentation of pathways in England, for example, and their ritual annual navigation by hikers to keep them open, which is what goes on. Because these pathways in England, often date back, 600-700 years when land uses were very different. They're still there, they're still walked, and they're held onto. It's fascinating. These practices of sort of ritually keeping them open seem to me to be democratic and progressive, not so that if there's an aura side to Long, that's what I'm saying, it's not that that aura is having some sort of authoritarian role. It's actually preserving something valuable. In this respect, Richard Long's work lines up, to my mind, with poets like Gary Snyder and Wendell Berry, and writers like David Abram, who similarly attempt to promote a renewed sense of place, a theme taken up philosophically by our good friend Ed Casey, a philosopher who's written a number of books about place. Now we know that the value of place can be deployed for reactionary ends. The same goes for community, identity, home. They can be vehicles, these concepts can be vehicles for intolerance, exclusion of the other, racism. But we can't just repudiate values that can be misused. The sense of homelessness evinced by the advocates of space colonization. You know, we've had enough of this planet. Let's see if we can find another planet, a better one, where we can mess that up. This suggests to me a real pathology of place or of terrestrial dwelling that desperately needs attention. If we follow provisionally Heidegger's sense of the possibility that art can stage the strife between earth and world, can disclose truth, making available to us the earth as a spontaneous forthcoming, and so on, then we have to ask how that dwelling on and with earth can be lost sight of. And how would we, how does this alienation happen? Why do we need art to sort of heal us or to repair the damage? Well, there seem to be two kinds of answer you could give. One would be historical, and the other a bit more metaphysical. The first answer would rest on some sort of story about the modern age, about technology, about the commodity form. We've sort of talked a bit about that. It could be aligned with various theses about the end of art, which could be dated and motivated in various ways, as we can with Hegel or with Dante. On this argument, the problem of terrestrial alienation, of not being at home on the planet any longer, is historical. It might be traced, for example, to changes in our material conditions of life, like the movement from the countryside, from the land, to the city, which is a long-term historical trend, leaving us with these monster cities in which new kinds of problems of human habitation arise. Or the rise of consumerism. So they give a historical explanation for this sort of alienation. But the second kind of answer would focus on the more universal condition that Heidegger describes in his classic Being and Time. Here, the story would roughly be that daily existence requires a certain dulling of the disclosedness of truth. We need habits. Linguistic habits, material habits, social habits, bodily habits, just to survive. We need lots of autopilot settings, even if they blind us to the truth. And this is true whether or not those settings are benign or toxic. It could be true whether or not we adopted, for example, a sustainable lifestyle. On this model, if you accept the sort of metaphysical story that the need for habits is also the need for a certain kind of dulling, a certain kind of blindness to the truth about things, then maybe thinking or art or poetry could offer temporary events of disclosedness that might then open onto different modes of dwelling. In other words, there would be times at which our habit life was interrupted temporarily and we'd see things again. Oh my goodness, lost in the daily grind. Oh, here's a painting, or there's a bit of opera, or whatever. And then, but of course, that could just be something that enables you to carry on your daily grind, or it could, I'm going to try and do something different. I don't want to carry on just like that. That's given me an idea. I'm going to change my habits. Each of these two models would prescribe for art the role of reopening, perhaps recalibrating, ways of being in the world that allow us to cope, whether with specific historical conditions or with existence in general. The first, the historical, analysis would tend toward revolutionary transformation. You know, it's like this now, it doesn't have to be like that. It wasn't like that once, we're going to change the world, we're going to have a revolution. The second, the sort of metaphysical thought that we are always, whether we like it or, I mean, every society sort of tends towards this sort of habituation, would lead towards thinking of art as contributing to an ongoing process of healing, opening access to dimensions of existence that have to take a back seat in everyday life. If we take seriously the need for global changes in human dwelling, I suspect it won't be possible to choose one of these options rather than the other, because I think they're kind of connected. It will need dramatic change in our actual patterns of life, not just our attitudes to them. And while we'll need new habits, these will need to include the habit of creative reassessment of our habits. From our brief discussion of earth art, its most direct impact was perhaps on the parameters of dwelling that Heidegger called the fourfold, reminding us of the deep conditions of our mortal terrestrial existence with an indirect healing power. Now, I describe earth art as offering a literal example of how our art might begin to save the earth. Exploring art's saving power of dehabituation will open up a much broader palette. But first, I think we need to say a little bit about habit and the sources of habit. Now, there's an analogical relation, at least, between our everyday habituation and our responses to trauma, whether in the form of dramatic personal events or the experience of arriving on the scene as an infant, confronting the real. It may be surprising, but we have investments in ignorance, in blindness, and in illusion, as Nietzsche so eloquently describes in his essay on Truth and Lies. This is true whether we're consumers of simulacra, adrift from the material conditions of our pleasure, or whether we're Van Gogh's peasant who's just taken off her boots after a long day's work in the field. If I read Heidegger aright, art's needed not just for us viewers of art to grasp the truth of the peasant's world and her relation to the earth, it's even necessary for the peasant herself, who may be too close to the scene or the daily grind for any recognition of truth to have much room to breathe. The point of the analogy with trauma is that what follows from trauma are patterns of behavior that may indeed have allowed us to cope with the event or situation that was traumatic, and which are then deeply embedded in our lives and are very difficult to reverse, but which may also lock us into suboptimal ways of living. If Heidegger's right, these ways typically involve inappropriate or unsustainable attempts at domination and control. Remember that remark about saving the earth means trying to avoid treating the earth as this object that we master. Saving the earth would involve rolling back this project of subjugation as a sort of hyperbolic exaggeration of a normally much more limited need for order and predictability. We do need to, I mean, it's not as if, we need a door on our house. We need order, we need some sort of shaping and structuring. But that can become an obsession, and then I call it a hyperbolic exaggeration. Habits are patterns of repetition that supply, as it were, a domesticated space of intimate meaning in the face of a potentially threatening world. In particular, this would encompass the various ways in which we organize our bodily comportment, our ways of being embodied in the world: home, architecture, travel, workspace, community space, urban design, and so on. And I want to take bodily comportment as a key example of a site of habit or habituation. Habit is both enabling and disabling. it enables us by creating layers of what we could call the taken for granted, on which other possibilities can then be built. It disables, habits disable by hiding the field that it concretely occupies. And it may well interfere with other forms of bodily habitation. For example, too rigid a sense of body boundaries inhibits erotic engagement. It demands unnecessary levels of security, while the highly developed self-centeredness may starve compassion. Habit here refers both to overtly bodily habits, how we walk or throw a ball, whether we drive defensively, when we go to sleep and wake up, but also cognitive and emotional habits. And even if we're not caught up in the disabilities of grand trauma, the claim is that habit, in this broad sense, however necessary it is as a norm, is responsible very often for loss of pleasure, loss of joy and diversity, and for a kind of metaphysical deprivation that Heidegger speaks of when he talks of a crisis of dwelling. Now, the significance of talking about habit here becomes clear if we allow Heidegger's sense of art as disclosing truth to broaden into a more general capacity for dehabituation. That's a sort of move I'm trying to make. On this account, art is centrally engaged in dehabituation, allowing us to see things anew, to reopen the congealed field of embodied dispositions. This helps save the earth to the extent that it is our suboptimal habits of everyday and our everyday practices that are destroying it. In this light, Richard Long's walking excursions are ways of reminding us of atrophying modes of bodily dispositions like walking. And we can go down a list of sculptors and painters working in this area, that is, who are focusing on and thinking about the body, embodiment, and ways in which we inhabit our bodies. And this is just a fairly random collection of this is Boyce with his few days in a cage with a coyote. Just a flash of images, just the names I mentioned. Anthony Gormley, Damien Hirst, Richard Deacon, Joseph Boyce, Francis Bacon, Barbara Hepworth, Magdalena Abekanovich, and the list goes on and on. Art as bodywork operates through displacement, distortion, reconstruction, and transformed representation of the actual fleshy human body. By such means, it reopens what we might call the underlying schematizations and relationalities of embodiment, and facilitates our release from at least the taken for grantedness of these schemas and relations. So I'm trying to, so what I'm obviously saying, and perhaps I should make it explicit, is that we don't just have bodies. We inhabit our bodies in certain ways. There's a sort of wonderful example from Foucault, in which I think it's from Discipline and Punish, in which he talks about, I think, about the 18th century recruitment of soldiers. I think this is right. In the 18th century, they would, you're looking for, this is in Europe, looking for soldiers. You'd look for people who walked like this. Well, that's a soldier. That's the sort of person we want. And I think when they sort of ran out of people like that, in the later part of the 18th century, early part of the 19th century, they didn't mind who they got. I mean, they'd get anyone, any people even like you, right? And they'd turn them into people who could do this, right? They'd train them. So the point is, you could create a body. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be naturally like that to start with. And the claim, of course, is not that we have all been trained in a military sense, but that the way that our bodily dispositions, the ways we deep down think about not just our bodies, but our modes of engagement with each other and with the world as material beings are culturally produced and can be healthy and less healthy, help us flourish and can be toxic. The idea of throwing things away is sort of fascinating. That away means separated from us. We don't want to see that again. We are separate from it. We can talk about this separately, if you like. Art, of course, may not be enough to bring about the sorts of transformations that I'm talking about. We've known since Freud that the effects of trauma and our investments in these less than adequate patterns of behavior are not reversed just by becoming aware of them. But we might hope that the value of art is precisely what Hegel thinks of as its limitation, that it's not the same thing as reason or science, but it might be precisely for that reason be able to intervene in breaking loose these locked-down dispositions. This specific reference to art as a surrogate site, and this is what I'm claiming, that art is a sort of surrogate site for exploring alternative shapes of embodiment, is meant to make a more general point. With reference to film and to earth art, I've argued that complicity with the market and commodification is not a fatal obstacle to art having salutary effects. The more general point is one that cuts right against any sense of the end of art. Art as body work in all these sort of extended and indirect ways may not be revolutionary in the sense of announcing a single new and compelling dispositional dispensation, but it does mobilize resistance to those modes of embodiment that most support what we could call toxic dwelling. And I'm just thinking, just to give you some examples or some thoughts here. Well, think about blindness to the origin of the stuff that we use and buy. We don't want to know where it comes from. You know, I remember once buying a jacket, a really nice linen jacket, and I got it home and I realized it was made in China. This was 15 years ago, and I'd just been reading an article about prison labor, and I realized actually I'd been buying something that had been made by slave labor in Chinese prisons, and I didn't want to have bought that. But, you know, actually I didn't want to know that. I really didn't want to know that. So I want it kept separate, and I just want to be able to buy the jacket. And of course, I don't really want it. I mean, I really do want to know that. But at another level, I don't want to know that. I'd rather just have the stuff on the shelf and then have it in my closet. And then, on the other end, there's this complacency about throwing things away. You know, I want to be able to just put the trash and just have it disappear. Right? Now these are, I think they are connected to our sense of our bodies. There's me over here, this body, and there's that other stuff that happens elsewhere. And I want to just be able to consume it and get rid of it and regulate the relationship between the world and me in that nice, simple way. And I want to understand these things in a sort of linear way. I don't want to see these as cycles. I don't want to see, you ever tried spitting out the window in a train? And you shouldn't do it. It just comes straight back at you. You know? And so I think we like to live with these sort of linear models. And in fact, we really should think in terms of cycles, feedbacks, and so on. I've got about 10 more minutes. I know it's longer than it should be. Can you handle 10 more minutes, knowing that it will come to an end? All right. If commodification, or what Heidegger calls the Gestell, or technology, is the reigning paradigm, art may not be able to unify and lead a historical people, as Hegel lamented, but it may, across a broad front, be able to encourage and promote resistance to the paradigm of commodification. For Heidegger, saving the earth consisted in preserving the strife between earth and sky. earth and world, I'm sorry. If we were to gloss this as keeping open the play between the sustaining powers to which we are ultimately subject, Earth, and the space of possibility and life practices that we create for ourselves, world, the idea of art as resistance to sclerotic versions of this Earth-world relationship would fit right in. On my reading, these rigidifications appear and arise at many levels in many ways. Habits and embodied dispositions are just examples. There are many others that span the field of even the most abstract of modern art. And as we've mentioned, Michael Fried, in about 1967, decried what he called the theatricality of minimalist art. And here are some examples, I guess, of minimalism. Promoting art that attends to the distinctively aesthetic experiences that it generates in the course of its own activity as art. But that's what he preferred. But on our reading, this distinction and this whole critical discussion actually just marks different levels at which art might save the world. If earth art is theatrical in that it dramatizes the relation between earth and sky, I mean, almost literally with the lightning and cosmic resonances and so on, it's because it effectively engages the observer. You get engaged, you find yourself living on the planet again. But both the geometrical and the more squiggly forms of the abstract expressionism that Fried was promoting play with line, shape, boundaries, and as such open up, albeit abstractly and on a canvas, questions about reality and representation, about the relation between things and entities, foreground and background, inside and outside, and so on. And these issues are ultimately connected, maybe a bit abstractly, to existential questions about how, outside art, we regulate our engagement with the world, that is, say, questions of dwelling. They may not be direct connections, but they're deep. Our preferences for order, for geometry, for closure and enclosure, the tension between personal feeling and outer shape, which are, these sorts of questions are found in art of even the most abstract sort. These are issues in play or at play in the deepest levels of the kind of dwelling that Heidegger is seeking to redeem. And again, the fact that these are often embodied in paintings with commodity values may make it easy to lose sight of their qualities as art, but it needn't cut against their deeper significance in this game of disclosure and truth. In other words, commodification is a danger, yes, but it's not a fatal danger. Central to my argument here is that if art may be thought to save the world by protecting and encouraging other possibilities of dwelling, this can and does happen in many ways and many levels. To the extent that art deploys framing, as in a painting or a particular installation, as a sculpture or a building, it can't help in some way putting into play the whole question of the relation between the things that we humans shape and create and focus on the one hand, the sort of shaping side of things, and the outside, the nature, background, and the away from which we separate it. The routinization of this relation in the form of production methods that generate waste dumped into sinks like the ocean and the atmosphere. These are two big sinks that we throw things into, like there was no tomorrow, is precisely the pattern of subjugation, of subordination and what we call spoliation that Heidegger says we need a God to save us from. I'm arguing that across the board that art offers opportunities to contest this operation, and in particular contest its unthinking routinization. Filling out the various ways in which art might save the earth, it's worth reminding ourselves that the aesthetic, at least, is not always on the side of salvation. When we think about art saving the earth, we're tempted by two kinds of aesthetic illusion. There's the illusion of the spectacular and the illusion of the spectacle. The spectacular illusion involves or flows from the desire for a certain kind of natural beauty. Let's say that of a landscape painting, the sort of eco-porn favoured by the Sierra Club. It used to be favoured by them. Actually, I apologise for this. I tried to find a really good example of eco-porn, and I just came up with, because I wanted one of those sort of mountain, vista type things, and this is very quickly all I found. I readily admit I'm drawn to these scenes as much as the next two-legged. The appeal, that is, of grand vistas may date back to the feeling of safety that our Neolithic ancestors had when they could survey for danger perched up a tree. But these scenes are beautiful scenes, which I'm confessing I find just as attractive as you do, set a false standard for what needs preserving or protecting. And here I'd refer to Aldo Leopold's and his praise of bogs and marshes, which may not please the distant eye, but if we get down on our knees and look close, we find a scene bubbling with life and a more reticent beauty. And the rolling lawns of many a great country park, perhaps even your campus, are green monocultures, stunning canvases for sculpture. Right, I hadn't thought of that. Like heliotrope, but are environmentally poor, just grass. Doesn't sustain much. If there are ecological values like biodiversity that are only accidentally connected to beauty, art that itself has transcended such a narrow purview is well placed to represent them. The other temptation, what I'm calling the spectacle, is a theatrical dream, that some great event would tear the veils from our eyes and let us see. We conjure up a public scene like the storming of the Bastille, after which nothing would be the same again. Imagine the unveiling of the Reichstag after Christo wrapped it, bringing some cosmic revelation. It's all unwrapped, and then, like Blake, God sort of sends down the revelation from the sky. Or imagine Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, changing the world. These are aesthetic illusions. In other words, I'm saying we sort of dream of this, but it's an aesthetic illusion that this might happen. Themselves a reflection of a certain desire for palpable presence, for a change that we can witness. When it comes to saving the earth, this desire is an understandable response to the urgency of the situation. For as much as we may come to understand that this will involve or require a different way of living, a different dispensation of dwelling in Heidegger's sense, we're acutely aware that there may well be event thresholds on the horizon, literally in climatological terms, irreversible tipping points. The Earth as a planet wouldn't be the issue, and that's going to continue. But the Earth as a system of life-sustaining energies, tuned in anything like the current way, could well be at issue. In his Beiträge and in his Der Spiegel interview, Heidegger's not just managing expectations, as the saying goes, but he does insist that neither thinking nor art or poetry can do more than prepare the way for a new order, a new God, a new change, a real change. If we were to pursue this line, we'd be announcing not the end of art, but the end of a certain aesthetic model of the power or efficacy of art. In his book, Red Sky at Morning, Yale forestry dean Gus Speth addresses the problem of global climate change without specific reference to art, but weighing up a whole basket of approaches. How are we going to bring about a change in the disaster that we're generating? He says we need a whole basket of approaches, technological, spiritual, social, cultural, political, and so on. And he describes, got a lovely word for this. He calls this bundle of things green jazz. I think it's a nice expression. And his follow-up book, called The Bridge at the Edge of the World, I think it's The Bridge at the End of the World, he names the problem directly as consumer capitalism. This is, a very conservative dean of forestry. He says, I'm not a Marxist, it's nothing to do with being left-wing. This is just the problem is consumer capitalism and its obsession with growth. it would be tempting to think that while art might contribute to green jazz as one player on the stage, once the problem has been more clearly identified, the art should move aside and we should send in the heavy tanks. My argument is different. If art as a multiply distributed practice opens up at many levels the shapes of our investment in boundaries, in packaging the real, in denying the costs, in maintaining rigid inside-outside distinctions, in believing that all change is reversible. In other words, a whole set of toxic dispositions. And if art can at least make some of these connections or shapes of connection tremble a little, it may just be the softening up process and our increasing comfort in being able to play with and around these sorts of shapes that will make it possible to shift the patterns of dwelling needed to save the earth. Now, this prescription has two dimensions to it. The first is that there are vital analogies. I'm just trying to be explicit about what I've just been saying, just to wrap it all up. That there are vital analogies between what we might call the schemas of human embodiment, spatial and temporal, and those explored by various kinds of art. By virtue of various kinds of distance, art allows proxy exploration of how these modes of embodiment might be changed. And by consequence, the relation to the world and to others that they imply. The other dimension is that of desire. These schemas of embodiment are the sites of desires, often appearing as habits, by which humans, individuals, are bound to social processes. And that if I were to go down that path, I'd want to start talking about Reich and discussion of body armor, Adorno on the authoritarian personality, Heidegger on Gelassenheit, Deleuze and Guattari on anti-Oedipal, non-fascistic forms of thinking, and so on. It's important with Joseph Beuys, for whom every human being is an artist, as he says, to think here of art not as the special possession of artists, but as a widely shared capacity. In terms of efficacy, what it would mean for art to save the earth is that the multi-leveled exhibition and performance of a whole range of practices that would contest the growth economy, even at the level of our sort of micro habits, might well make the difference between necessary structural transformations happening or not happening. Public sentiment is often a key factor in whether new laws actually get written into the books. A general culture of art as disturbing of schemas and desires might be a necessary condition, if not a sufficient one, for the change we need. And here I'm echoing Heidegger's claim that art can at least prepare the way. Now, if I had more time, which I don't, I would develop this account of how art can save the world in two directions. I'd try and put bones onto Krauss's sense of an expanded field of art, which marks not so much the end of art as the end of our captivation with a certain aesthetic. Today, and I was reading a wonderful book on the plane here about participatory art, but the sort of what we're talking about here moves into things like performance art, participatory art, interactive art, installation art, video art, new media art, science collaborations, innovatory forms of dance, theater, and so on. Typically, art is understood as an engaged process rather than as an object, and as such has a particular power to recalibrate habit. And second, I'd put more stress on the conceptual dimension of contemporary art. These perhaps run into a certain tension with each other, these two forks. While I've given a certain privilege to the dislodging of embodied habits, such as rigid boundary protection, there are deep cognitive frames that equally need challenging. Think of the work of George Lakoff. For example, one of his books is called Don't Think of an Elephant. You try it. Don't think of an elephant, right? You mustn't think of an elephant, but you're thinking of an elephant. As I ask you not to, the frame, as it were, is coming through without your being able to stop it. It's no accident that the most highly paid political consultants focus on framing debates and issues. framing them. And conceptual art is especially good at framing and reframing and deframing. My colleague, this is the last thing, my colleague Mel Ziegler's piece, Catch and Release, in which a US soldier is photographed catching air in a hostile Iraq. This is somewhere in Iraq. Subsequently, I gather, to be released next month in the same uniform, same soldier, at the University of Virginia, uses images to break our insular bubble. We breathe the same air as our enemy, and Ziegler brings it home to us. In other words, it's a nice image, but the power of this is not in the image. It's the power is in the concept, the idea of releasing air that come from somewhere else. So, 2 more comments from the margin to end. I'm not naive. For art to flourish in the way I'm describing, it needs to be part of a broader, critically lively culture, itself embedded in and reinforcing emancipatory educational practices. Art by itself, you can't just parachute it in and fix the world. It needs to be part of a culture too. And secondly, art cannot claim sole ownership of this, even this creative space. Political theatre of various sorts may not be art, but it plays its part in displacing our habitual frames. It's the same with advertising, documentaries, reports, deconstructed texts, and so on. So I began with the thought that we needed art to help us bridge the imagination gap, to make our potentially catastrophic future vividly imaginable. And I end with the thought that what art can perhaps do better is to disturb the constitutive shapes of our bodily, spiritual, social, and economic investments in our modified world, and thereby soften our resistance to change. It helps us begin to feel our way toward imagining and living otherwise, even though we need a dramatically expanded and diversified version of it. This is, I think, what Heidegger meant by saving the world. Sorry, it was longer than I meant.